Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation with Gurminder K. Bhambra on decolonizing social theory, public sociology, and digital platforms. To very quickly introduce our speaker, she is a professor of historical sociology at the University of Sussex. She is the co-author of Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, Polity 2021, with John Holmwood, and author of Connected Sociologies, Bloomsbury 2014, and the award-winning Rethinking Modernity, Postcolonialism and the Sociological Imagination, Palgrave 2007. She is also co-editor of the SAGE Handbook of Global Sociology, SAGE 2024, and of Imperial Inequalities, the Politics of Economic Governance Across European Empires, Manchester University Press 2023. She is a fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Historical Society, and the Academy of Social Sciences, and has been president of the British Sociological Association, BSA, and trustee of the Sociological Review Foundation. She runs Global Social Theory site, is a co-editor of Discover Society, and also directs the Connected Sociologies curriculum project. We are also happy to have Professor Maitri Chaudhary with us, who, as you all know, is a former professor of sociology at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She is one of the co-founders of Doing Sociology, as well as the current president of the Indian Sociological Society. Professor Bhambra, we welcome you to this discussion and thank you so much for making time and talking to us.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Right. So we went through some of your works, and we would like to begin with this question of what you think about colonialism and if it is a modern phenomena, and how is it connected to European ideas of expansionism and capitalist modernity?
So I think perhaps one of the first things to say is that the issue for me is not so much whether colonialism is a modern phenomena, but rather thinking about the ways in which what we understand to be the modern very rarely has space for the colonial within it. So if we think about the ways in which modernity, which is a central sociological concept, has been defined, it tends to be defined in terms of histories and events that are associated effectively with Europe. So we think about the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. These are often presented as the key paradigmatic events that generate what comes to be understood as the modern world. And the modern world and all its institutions and its different sorts of features and processes are seen to emerge in Europe and then spread around the rest of the world. And so when I first started doing my research and I was looking at this concept of modernity and its place and its centrality to sociology, one of the things that I found so puzzling was that colonialism was never part of people's analyses of how and why these modern ideas either emerged, but not even in terms of how they spread. So when people talk about these ideas spreading around the world, well, one of the key ways in which they would have spread would have been colonialism. And yet colonialism is not even acknowledged in those terms. But I didn't want to think about colonialism as simply a vector for the spread of modern ideas. What I was interested in was to think about the ways in which colonialism was actually central to the emergence of what we then come to understand as modern. And actually, there is no way of understanding our modern world, that is, either our contemporary world or then the world that is understood as modern within sociology, without understanding its formation in colonial histories. So that's a slightly different way, I think, of tackling this question of colonialism, the modern, and sociology. It's really, for me, my work has been about putting colonialism in at the heart of sociology and then thinking how sociology needs to be transformed in the process.
Right. So when you say that, are you also suggesting that there is a need to reconsider modernity itself, as a framework which centers the West in the knowledge production process?
Absolutely. And I think that there's a sense in which when critiques have been made about the sort of Eurocentricity of the idea of modernity, one of the key ways in which people have sought to address those critiques is then shifting to this idea of multiplicity, that we can have multiple modernities or plural modernities or alternative modernities. But within a framework that is organized in terms of multiplicity, what we still have is the centrality of the West for the original version of modernity, and everybody else gets a multiple version of that. So I'm not arguing for multiplicity or plurality in that context. I'm arguing for the need to reconstruct our very understanding of modernity by taking colonialism into account. So that would transform how we think about the modern, what the modern is, and the consequences of the modern for the worlds within which we live in the present.
Right. And if we go back to your writings where you use the term connected histories, could you tell us a little bit about it? What do you mean by that, and how does it help to get out of the bind of ideal types?
So, I mean, connected histories is a phrase that Sanjay Subrahmanyam, the historian, used to sort of think about the ways in which, when you're looking into the past, there is no, if you know of an event, there is no way that you know of it, except that there are other events connected to it. So there's always a way to find, if you follow those threads, to find out what that past is about. So I was interested in his notion of connected histories, and I used it within the sociological context to talk about connected sociologies as a push to think about, as a new perspective, I guess, to center colonialism in our understanding of sociology. So if we're thinking about what's happening, say, within Europe, there is nothing that happens within Europe that is not connected to these broader colonial processes. And so the idea of using the term connected sociologies, it's almost like a provocation to always think about the broader context within which we consider events and understandings that often tend to be understood in endogenous terms, that is, just in terms of the nation. And I also have a critique of the idea of the nation as the frame within which we do our research, and I think that's problematic. So the idea of connected sociologies is effectively an argument to think about colonialism in the context of thinking about the other issues that we're concerned with within sociology.
Right. And when we're talking about this colonial history, we also should talk about a term that is very much in the vogue right now, decolonization. You have also, spoken about it and written about it. So let me ask you, what would decolonization mean specifically, and how is it different from post-colonialism?
So for me, decolonization refers to a political and economic movement, effectively, and it's about the attempt to undo the structures of colonization. So it involves both political independence, arguments for self-determination, which have tended to be organized in terms of national self-determination, although there were different modes and models that were argued for by people like Césaire and even by Nauroji in the very beginnings and so on, where there was an idea of a sort of federated self-determination that was possible. So nationalism doesn't have to be part of that, but it has tended to become that in practice. But alongside that, there would also need to be a decolonization from the economic modes of colonial political economy that have been established. And that's one aspect which I don't think has been addressed in quite as in any way equivalent to political independence. And so we're still stuck within the very structures of colonial political economy that were characteristic of colonialism. And I think part of the problem, or the reason for that, is because we often misunderstand colonial political economy as capitalism. And we think of capitalism simply as an economic system that exists separately from colonial histories. But much of my work has also been about demonstrating the ways in which what we understand as capitalism should actually be understood in terms of a colonial political economy, because all the structures and features that we think of as capitalism and ascribe simply an economic base to them actually are formed through the colonial histories that have led to their emergence and their reproduction. But the failure to take colonialism into account has us misunderstand these economic processes as simply economic processes and not also as political processes. So I think in that sense, the work of decolonization is practical work in the world for the undoing of the structures of colonialism, and decolonizing where it comes to be used as a metaphor for other sorts of work, I think is problematic.
Right. And while we're talking about decolonizing, I want to bring up the question of the university. write about decolonizing the university specifically. So questions, should decolonizing projects even be concerned with the university as an institution?
Well, in the process of decolonization, universities have had different sorts of roles. So universities within India, for example, during the period of the anti-colonial movements and during the period of decolonization, often played a very active role in providing resources and both intellectual and material for thinking about and acting in anti-colonial ways for decolonization. So I was in India earlier this year, and I was in Punjab, and there's a new museum there looking at the sort of contribution of Punjab to the independence movement. And there was a lot there about Khalsa College and the ways in which the faculty and students at the college were active in the movements for decolonization, and the ways in which arguments about the very governance of the college and the university were central also to claims for independence of knowledge making, but then also political independence to enable the independence of knowledge making to occur. And so I think there's a place for the university, that the university has already been central to decolonization. I think in terms of the phrase around decolonizing the university, a lot of that has got to do with the fact that within the West, there is hardly any consideration of the extent to which colonialism has been central to the formation of institutions, politics, social structures within, say, Europe. And given that I grew up in Europe, I grew up in Britain, this has been the context within which I have come to my understandings, but also in the context of a family that moved from India to Kenya and then to Britain. I've also been aware of these broader histories that have always connected Britain to other places. It always puzzled me that why was that broader history not part of the self-understanding either of people generally, or then what was being taught in schools or universities. So what was the place for me? In this place, it was always as a foreigner, as an outsider, as an immigrant. And yet, once I started tracing the histories, I realized that I came to Britain as British because the British had been in India, as the British Empire. So I don't come to Britain as a migrant. My grandparents came to Britain as citizens because it was the period of the British Empire where everybody in the British Empire was a subject of the British Empire. So we didn't cross any political borders when we moved, and yet the way in which we come to be understood living here is as outsiders, as immigrants, as people who did cross political borders. And I think partly, if we're talking about decolonizing within the university, it would be the need to rethink our concepts and categories, again, to take colonialism seriously, so that the way in which, say, a citizen is understood is so tied to ideas of the nation. But Britain wasn't a nation, it was an empire. So its category of citizenship was related to empire. The very moment when the British Nationality Act was established in 1948, the first key form of citizenship was that you would be a citizen of the UK and its colonies. The colonies were not separate from UK citizenship. It was the same thing. And yet that has been forgotten in the subsequent sort of 50, 60 years to now make the colonies as somehow having been separate. So I think there again, this notion of decolonizing the university, for me here, it's about making colonialism central to our self-understanding so that we can better think through the processes of knowledge production that the university is about.
Right. And what role do social movements or campaigns play in this whole project of decolonizing the university?
So I think social movements have been fundamental to sort of bringing new ideas to a wider public consciousness and to enable people to make particular sorts of demands and reconfigure their understanding. So if we think about the women's movement, the movement for gay liberation, the movement, and also independence movements and so on, these are all movements where people have felt that the current structures, the current forms of organization are not sufficient to address the concerns that they have or to reflect their lived experiences. And so in that sense, there's been a push to have that be recognized and for that recognition to make a difference. And so I think we've done a lot of work in terms of recognition, but we haven't gone far enough in terms of transformation of the concepts in light of that recognition. So I think there's still a gap and still work to be done. And what social movements have often done is pushed us to go further than perhaps we might have thought about. They open up new audiences, they open up new topics for consideration, and they also demand more of us in terms of how we think about these things and what resources we can provide back to those movements. So I think, yes, I hope that.
Right. To ask you from another line of inquiry, and this is, part of what you are doing. You are involved in the development and building of this website called Global Social Theory. So how did the idea emerge, and how did this sort of come to you in terms of building a website on theory?
So I was teaching theory, and and when one teaches theory, it's often, Hegel, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and moving through, and there's a very particular body of work that we look at. And I was concerned that our understandings of theory and who does theory was so limited. And I didn't want to make the argument that other people have also thought, because in a way, other people have, of course, also thought. The point is, their thinking has very rarely been made part of our intellectual reproduction of thinking. And so what I wanted to do with the website was make available to me, because in a sense, often when I had conversations with colleagues, and I was like, well, why can't we include more people? What about these other people? And people would often sort of say back to me, oh, I don't have the time to read more. I don't know how to work out who to include, who not to include. I don't know of anybody. This is what I was taught. And because this was what I was taught, this was what I will keep teaching. And so I thought, instead of sort of trying to persuade people that they should change, I could provide resources that would enable them to change. And even if it didn't enable them to change their own modules, they could include it in their reading lists and say to the students, I haven't had time to look at this, but look, here's a site that gives you information about lots of different people who've thought about different things from other parts of the world. And so it's a resource for students who wish to be able to follow. And what we tried to do is structure the website so we have a short sort of biography and intellectual biography of the individual, some of their key readings, open access where possible, and then some questions, so that if somebody wanted to sort of use the site almost as a form of independent study, they would have some initial information, further reading, and then some questions to provoke thought and to help them think about the issues more deeply. And this was it was crowdsourced. So sometimes I would get emails from people saying, why haven't you got this person on the website? And it's like, because it's crowdsourced. Would you like to write the entry? I'm very happy to put it up. So I've been happy to, put up entries that people have provided on different sorts of thinkers and theorists, and also people that sometimes people wouldn't think of as thinkers or theorists. But nonetheless, people have found something useful in what they have to say, and we're happy to include those. So we don't police the boundaries of who is a theorist. We're happy to sort of, and so that website has just been available. It's slowed down a little bit now in terms of additional contributions, but I think it's still there as a resource for people to use.
Right. And now sort of to, go back to the question of history, the past, and then bringing it, connecting it to social theories. Would you suggest that the ways in which we understand the past have implications for the social theories we develop to deal with the situations in the contemporary?
Absolutely, because if we don't understand the past, we don't really have an understanding of how we got here or why the world is organized in the way it is. I mean, if we think about it in terms of, say, issues of inequality within the West, at least, when we think about issues of poverty, for example, it's often naturalized. It's like, oh, this place over there, it is poor, and we just happen to be rich. And I'm trying to sort of present the argument that no, anywhere in the world that is poor has been made poor by the very same processes that have made the places that are rich, rich. There is no natural wealth and there is no natural poverty. All wealth and poverty is connected through historical processes. And so the wealth of the West is connected to the making poor of much of the rest of the world. And so if we denaturalize that understanding, and if we understand it as connected, then it would also change the way in which we might deal with issues of poverty. Because again, here in the West, one of the ways when we're talking about poverty or inequality, one of the arguments is, oh, well, we can provide charity. Or if it's not charity, it becomes development. You know, these other places need to be developed. And it's like, they don't need to be developed. What needs to be done is for there to be a redistribution of the resources that you appropriated from them through colonialism. So if we think about the issue in reparative terms, what we're doing is acknowledging that the wealth that we have here in the West has not been produced through the legitimate activities of those in the West, but actually through the theft, appropriation, dispossession of others in the rest of the world. Then arguments around poverty and inequality would be based around arguments of justice and for reparations, not of charity or benevolence or development. So I think that in that way, an understanding of the past helps us to have better sociological theories in the present that would hopefully also open up the possibility of a different sort of politics in the present to be able to push for different sorts of solutions to the many problems that we face.
So a connected question, rather two questions would be, is there a need to decolonize social theory? And early on, you did discuss about, your the website that you run called Global Social Theory. So this brings me to the question of the digital. Do you see digital as an avenue that can promote decolonizing in social theory?
Absolutely. So perhaps I answer the second one first. I mean, I think what the digital enables is new connections both between constituencies within the same place, but also new constituencies across space. So it makes the global public sphere, if you like, much smaller, and the possibility to make these sorts of connections. And that's really important because every new connection is transformative, and it transforms both the conditions in which the connections were made and the possibilities that those connections then provide for the future. So I think the digital is absolutely vital to our new times, but we should also remember that it's a tool that we use. It isn't the solution to those problems. It's a new tool that we have to be able to try and think through these issues, but that thinking still needs to be done. In terms of decolonizing social theory, again, I would put it slightly differently. I think, and that's partly why we called our book Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, because it's, again, that need to understand the way in which colonial processes, colonial histories have shaped what we understand as social theory, but without any acknowledgement of colonialism as part of what creates social theory. And so if we put colonialism back into social theory, and even into those classic canonical thinkers, it's not that we necessarily need, or that the solution to the problems is simply elsewhere. It's also in rethinking what we currently have. So if we think about Weber, not in terms of the theorist of the state who argues about the monopoly of violence and so on, but we acknowledge that what Germany was at the time was an incipient colonial power, but also that Weber argued that the only way to be a strong nation was to be a world power, that is, to be a colonial power. Then we would understand that the success of the nation state is linked more to colonialism than to anything to do with the nation. And so what we call today weak nation states, they're not weak in comparison to strong nation states. They're weak because they don't have empires. They don't have colonial outposts. And if what we're arguing is that states should, as nation states, should be strong, then we're arguing that they should have colonial empires. And is that what we wish to argue? So it's like trying to break that link between the nation, the state, and political organization, and to open up that possibility that we could think about different ways to organize ourselves politically that don't have to be determined by the history of the West. And that history has been presented as a history of strong nation states, but it was never strong nation states. It was always strong states with colonial empires. That cannot be the future of our world. It's just not possible. And so we have to think about another way in which we can organize this. So in that sense, I'm less concerned about decolonizing social theory in its own terms, rather than more adequately understanding the theory that we have as a form of theory that's based on colonialism but doesn't acknowledge it, and then thinking, okay, what space does that now open up for us to think differently? And of course, using the work of other people who aren't wedded to these systems is also going to be vital in opening up those spaces. And so it's more of a dialogic, iterative process than simply, let's throw this out, bring something else in, that'll be fine. It's like, no, because our common sense concepts are still shaped by those understandings. And until we transform the common sense understandings, we're not going to have the space really to think about different sorts of possibilities.
Right, and that's an interesting point that you make. Well, you've also been the president of the BSA very recently, in fact. Therefore, we want to know from you about the role of a professional body like the BSA in the promotion of sociology and, of course, public sociology as well.
So I think professional associations are vital to defend the discipline. They're vital to promote the diversity of views within sociology and to provide that sort of space. And they're also important because as associations, they're often long-standing to connect new developments within sociology with the broader base of sociologists. So I think that the new initiatives that emerge, often from the grassroots and so on, are really powerful in their own terms. And when they work with associations, then they can amplify their understandings to a broader base of sociologists and then hopefully further beyond that. So I think that sort of relationship is a really important one to keep. The association is there to defend the discipline and to defend the conditions within those who work in the discipline work, and then to promote the understandings and the developments that occur within the discipline to a wider sort of constituency. So I think associations are vital to that work.
Thank you. And before we end this, I would like to know from you, what role do you think the digital plays in promoting public sociology?
Well, it's been so we've talked about the Global Social Theory site a bit, which has been, it was a nice way to make connections with people around the world who also wanted to have people associated with their geographical areas represented on the site. And so people would contribute entries on a variety of people. And so we could, in one digital space, we could provide resources from lots of different geographical spaces that were available for everybody to be able to access. One of the other things that I've done more recently is something called the Connected Sociologies Curriculum Project. And this was in part emerging again out of a sort of a sense of unease that the teaching of sociology, of history within the UK context very rarely has colonialism central to it. And so we wanted to, or I wanted to create a website which had resources which include short video lectures, again, access to open access articles and questions and so on, that took common themes, but presented them in a way where colonialism had been part of the thinking of the colleagues who were putting forward the lectures. So we have one module, for example, on the making of the modern world. I do a lecture in that on the Haitian Revolution and the thinking of the importance of the Haitian Revolution for understandings of democracy, because usually when we talk about democracy, it's the American Revolution and the French Revolution are presented as the key political moments. for the emergence of democracy. Yet the Haitian Revolution happens at almost the same time as the American and the French, and yet it's never included. Why? Well, partly because it was people who had been enslaved who created their revolution both against colonization as well as for political independence. And so in that, and I think part of the reason why it's not acknowledged is precisely because one of the countries from which it was seeking independence was France. And France is otherwise presented as, you know, the origin of democratic political practice. How would our understandings of France change if we acknowledged that at the same time as arguing for political liberty within France, it was denying that to those who were enslaved and colonized in Haiti? And so sort of we've also got modules on the colonial global economy, on policing, on British rights and citizenship. I mean, it's very much UK focused because it was intended as a resource for colleagues within the UK to be able to have short lectures, and we've created lesson plans to go with that to try and help then also teachers at secondary schools before university to be able to use these resources, which are aimed at first-year undergraduates, but could also be used within a younger age group. And so it's, again, the attempt to create resources that people can use either to supplement their teaching in a way that brings an understanding of our colonial past central to the ways in which we think about sociology. So I think the digital has been an extraordinary development that enables these sorts of initiatives to be more widely available and for more people to connect with them. And the fact that, you know, all the stuff that I've been involved in producing has always been free. There's no paywall, there's no money made from it. I use my own resources to sort of fund the websites and to set them up just because I'm committed to the public dissemination of these sorts of ideas. I was lucky with the Connected Sociologies curriculum project that was funded by the Sociological Review Foundation. And so we had people who could work to make the connections and do all that. So that was really useful for that, and to keep the website and the resources all free. So the digital has been a great space to be able to open up the curriculum and to bring other forms of expertise and knowledge to be more widely disseminated to bigger and different publics.
Thank you, Professor Bhambra, for your very interesting insights. Thank you for answering all our questions. And now we'd like to invite Professor Chaudhry and Rituparna. She mentioned she's one of the co-founders of Doing Sociology and currently the president of the Indian Sociological Society. So we would like to hear Professor Chaudhry probably a few comments on the discussion that we've just had.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhambra. This was a real pleasure to hear you and your many insights on a whole set of issues which have been very central to us who teach and research sociology in our parts of the world. So in fact, the first course that I was entrusted to teach when I began teaching was called Social Change in Modern India. And the normal practice was to take a set of concepts like modernization, westernization, and discuss it. And I felt that that's impossible if we don't study the history of colonialism, in India, wherein modern social change began. So many of us perhaps did not have any easy familiarity or even a term like decolonial theory, but it was hands-on, trying to bring in texts which were different into the mainstream sociology syllabus. And in an Indian context, for very long, we were dominated by the Parsonian idea of structural functionalism. So it was very difficult to speak, very difficult to bring in another kind of language to the discussion of in fact, the term modernity was barely used at that point of time. It was the modernization framework. But later, when modernity became the more appropriate word in currency, there was a new kind of attempt to bring, invisibilize colonialism. So there was a sort of worrying trend where all of us were post-colonial societies. And somebody who was born and brought up and educated in our parts, I found it very difficult to understand, say, American colonialism the same way as the colonialism, the British colonialism in India. Both America, the United States, and India were colonized by the British. But the historical experiences of those two colonialism were fundamentally different. And we were literally trying to make sense of these divergences. But what we were trying to do in our parts, there was no digital sociology, was it was very difficult to amplify our voices. So as you correctly said, digital sociology allows me to talk to you, to listen to you, which would be impossible in an earlier epoch, where it would be only very, very few people who would have the opportunity either to go abroad and study or interact with scholars in that period. There has been, in a certain sense, a greater democratization, which makes it easier to converse. Like you said, every time there's a new communication, there's a new audience, there's a possibility of new transformations which are taking place. I was also very struck by the question of how you look at theory. And you mentioned the fact that you're not trying to box out certain theories as not being theoretical, because in my own experience of engaging with, say, feminist theory in our parts, I found in the early years when we were trying to argue that there is a conceptual history of feminism in our parts, the reaction was that we did not theorize. We did not have pieces like The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism, for example, in our parts. So the history of theorizing in our parts, therefore, was very much the history of doing. And you had to discern the theorizing in the history of doing, which is what you probably mentioned when you talked about the Khalsa College, practice, or the engagement at that period of time, when you are actually bringing in new questions, but without the legitimacy that today difference has, or even today, despite challenges, the legitimacy of decolonial knowledge practices, that this is an end that ought to be done. I also found a similarity when you talked about, adding on, that when you try to build up new voices and new writings, the issue you said is not just bringing in, but also to engage with those who are supposed to be the canons of sociological theory and to see what was absent and what was present, and in which to problematize the whole issues that they talked about. So France and Haiti, the relationship there, and what was accepted. The story is very similar in our parts in the anti-colonial movement, when many of the freedom fighters actually talked about the question that if a freedom or sovereignty is for all, then how come we are unfree? But the problem in our parts when it comes to syllabus, we have to go back to history and events, in a certain sense, bringing the empirical to problematize the theoretical. So there has been a certain criticism when we try to do it, saying that it's not theory enough. And theory has to be, in a certain sense, high theory, abstracted in particular forms, and historicizing is not theorizing. I had the same problem, say, for example, when I had to teach gender theory, and I had to, the assumption was that I have to begin by introducing liberal feminism, socialist feminism, radical feminism. It didn't make sense to me, because what did make sense to me is to argue that in India, we had already entered a colonially mediated modernity. And therefore, a certain articulation of modern thoughts and also peculiar combinations of how modernity, ideas of freedom or ideas of feminism were being articulated. It's a complex task, but like you said, it is enormously enriching and potentially possible of many more, kind of collaborations that could be done if we have the opportunity to talk to each other, share our experiences, both from the vantage place of the classroom, of syllabi making, of who is taught and who is not taught, and what is it, who is cited, who is not cited, and what exactly constitutes theory building, and in which fashion and in which language would even a decolonial theoretical framework be accepted. I really like the point that you made that you're not defending the issue of multiple modernities. You're not flagging off the idea of plurality, but what you are doing is integrating the very emergence of modernity in all the social institutions thereof, which began within colonialism, which again is structurally linked to the question of capitalism. A final couple of remarks. In our parts of the world, as you would be more familiar, and in different parts too, you do have a different kind of articulation of decolonial theory. In India in particular, at this point of time, decolonial theory is put forward as a celebration of majoritarian impulses or majoritarian and selective appropriation of the past and culture. And many people are drawn to it because it sounds attractive, it sounds radical. It is an irony of sorts because I would argue that in our parts, whatever social sciences, whether it is modern Indian history or sociology, have grappled with colonial questions, have also grappled with the complex nature of nationalism when it is articulated not from the vortex of the empire, but from the site of the colonial site, that what does nationalism mean to us? Is it necessarily limiting? Can it be a more liberating impulse, etc.? I don't want to go any further because this was such an enriching discussion that we had with you. And I thank you once again, and I hope to look forward to hearing you more often. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Bhambra, Professor Chaudhary. Again, I would completely agree and say that this was a very interesting discussion, and we were so happy to have you join us today. And to all our viewers, we doing sociology also is an open access platform where our content is freely available to all. And the idea with which, as Professor Chaudhary mentioned, we started this platform was to create, build a platform which provides resources to students, particularly in India, who don't have a lot of quality content in sociology and social sciences. So. Yeah, having said that, again, thanks to our speakers for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.